Welcome to Excel Campus. My name is John, and this is the first in a series of videos about pivot tables. So I want to introduce you to my friend Andy. Andy is new on the job, and he has been asked by his boss to create some reports and ultimately a dashboard for an upcoming presentation. All Andy was given is this giant sheet of data and a list of reports that his boss needs. Although he's excited about the challenge, Andy is wondering how he's going to turn this data into a nice-looking dashboard. Of course, he wants to save the day and become the superhero of the office. So what Andy really needs is to learn how to use pivot tables. In this video series, I'm going to show you how we're going to solve Andy's problem. We're going to take this sheet of data and turn it into a nice-looking interactive dashboard using pivot tables and pivot charts. We're going to build each of these reports using pivot tables and then bring it all together to create the dashboard. And don't worry if you think this looks complicated. Pivot tables are very easy to use and don't require any complex formulas or VBA macros. Just simple drag and drop. Throughout this video series, I'm also going to be showing you an add-in I developed called PivotPal. PivotPal makes it easier to work with some aspects of pivot tables and will save you a lot of time. But you don't need to have PivotPal to create these pivot tables and dashboards. Everything you need is already built into Excel. Alright, so in this first video, we're going to cover the basics of building a pivot table. I'm going to show you how to create this pivot table here that's a summary of revenue by sales rep, and also this pivot chart over here, which just displays that information visually. So we know that Andy has this set of data to work with. This is really all he's been given. And this is what we're going to use to create our pivot tables. This will be considered our source data. And before you start building a pivot table, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the source data, especially if you haven't seen it before. So this data was exported from our general ledger software, and basically it contains order details for December. So each row in the data here contains information for a specific order. So you can see we have the order date, some customer information here, the salesperson, region, we got some shipping information as I scroll over, and we also have some product information and then some information about the price of the product, the revenue, quantity, all that stuff. So it's good information. The other thing you want to do is make sure that your data is in a tabular format. And that just means that you have a row of headers here at the top of the data set, and each of these headers describes the column of data below. And I provided a checklist so you can go over this in more detail. The other things you want to look out for is that you want to make sure there's no blank columns within your header row here and no blank rows within your data set, especially if you have a column of dates. You want to make sure there's no blank rows or cells in your date column. You also want to look out for any merged cells. A lot of times when you're exporting data, the software will automatically merge some cells together, and you want to make sure you unmerge all the cells. So once your data is cleaned up, and this data looks pretty good, we'll go to the Insert tab on the ribbon and then click the Pivot Table button. And that'll bring up this Create Pivot Table window. And basically it's asking us to select the table or range. Now you can see that Excel has automatically detected the range for me, and that's because I had a cell selected inside the pivot table, or I'm sorry, inside the data set before I clicked the Create Pivot Table button. So as long as you do that, select a cell inside the range, click this button, and Excel will automatically detect the range for you. If it doesn't, you can just click this blue button over here and go and select your range. The next step is that we want to choose where we're going to put the pivot table. In this case, we'll put it on a new worksheet, so I'll go ahead and click OK. And now you'll see that's automatically added a new sheet to our workbook here and created this pivot table area. You'll also notice over on the right side that this pivot table fields list has appeared. And this is basically the window we're going to use to create the pivot table. So here's a list of all the fields in our data set here. And then down below is the areas that we can drag those fields into to create a pivot table report. So the first thing I'm going to do is find that salesperson field, and here it is here. And I'm going to drag that into the rows area. So I'm going to left click and hold, drag it into the rows area of the pivot table and drop it there. And you'll notice now that in the pivot table, it's listed our sales reps in the rows area of the pivot table. So each row contains a sales rep name. Now I want to add the revenue to this report as well, so I can get a summary of revenue. So I'm going to find this revenue field here in the field list, and then drag it into the values area of the pivot table. When I drag it into the values area and drop it there, you'll notice that Excel has automatically calculated the sum of revenue for each rep that's listed in the rows area of the pivot table. So this is really the power and the magic of the pivot table. It is automatically calculated the sum of revenue for each rep just almost instantly as we drag the field into the values area. And it's a good idea to get an understanding of what actually happens there. So let me try and explain this a little better. So here we can see Andrew has sales of 12,368 here in the pivot table. And basically what the pivot table has done, so if I go back to the data tab, I'm going to filter the salesperson field here for Andrew. So we're just seeing the sales that Andrew's done. And you can see here that he's done 8 sales in the month of December. Now if I go over to the rows column, and I'm just going to select these revenue numbers here. You could see here's our sum of revenue, 12,368 for Andrew. So basically the pivot table has done this filter and calculation for us. It's basically filtered the data set for each rep, each unique item in that field, and then calculated the sum of revenue for each rep. So it's a very powerful tool because with just a few clicks you could see that we've automatically created this nice summary report from our data set. And I also have a pivot table diagram here that just kind of shows you where each of these areas are within a standard pivot table. So you can see this is kind of a standard looking report. We have our sales rep here on the left side, we have quarters across the top, and then the sum of revenue here in the middle section, and up here we have the year, a filter for the year. So these are basically the different areas that you could drag fields into in the pivot table, and each of them displays information a little differently. So throughout this video series I'll explain how each of these areas within the pivot table works. Okay, so let's continue building out our pivot table. So probably the first thing you notice is that these numbers are not formatted. When we drug the revenue field into the values area, it did not format those numbers. So we want to format those, and the easiest way to do that is if you just right click on any cell in the values area there and then go to value field settings. That'll bring up this value field settings for the revenue field, sum of revenue, and we're going to click on the number format button. That'll bring up the format cells dialog. This one you're probably familiar with. I'm just going to choose currency, no decimals, click OK, and then click OK here. And you can see now that our numbers are formatted and they look a little nicer. The next thing I'm going to do is sort this information. So I want to put the top performing rep at the top of the list here. So basically I'm just going to select any cell in the values area and right click and then go to sort and sort largest to smallest. And now that's sorted our list here from largest to smallest. So we can see our top performing rep, which is Nancy, at the top of the list, and then our bottom performing rep, which is Jan, down at the bottom. So this now gives us some really good information. We can kind of see who's doing well and maybe who struggled this month or for some reason didn't do as well. And I'm more of a visual person, so I want to see this information in a chart as well. So as long as I have any cell selected in the pivot table, you can go up to the Analyze tab or the Options tab and click Pivot Chart. And that'll bring up this chart window, and I'm going to insert a bar chart and click OK. So now we've automatically created a bar chart here that it just allows us to visualize this information. And I'm going to quickly show you how we can clean this up, because the default chart formatting out of the box it's kind of ugly, honestly. So we're going to clean this up a bit. So the first thing I typically do is just hide all these field buttons. These field buttons allow you to apply filters, but we don't really need that for our dashboard. So I'm going to hide those. You'll also notice that these names here are in the opposite order of what they are here on the pivot table. So we need to reverse the order of this. So I'm going to right click here, go to Format Access. That'll bring up this Format Access window. It looks a little different in Excel 2010, but the options are the same. We go to Access Options, and then I'm going to check this box, Categories in Reverse Order. And that's going to reverse the order of these categories here so they match what's on the page. I'm going to close that. The other thing I want to do is, well, I'm going to get rid of these labels here, so I'm just going to left click to select those and hit the delete key on the keyboard. I'm also going to get rid of the legend, so click that and delete on the keyboard. and I want to get rid of these vertical lines. So I'm going to left click on those, delete, and then I also want to add some labels here. So in Excel 2013, you can just click on this plus button, go to data labels. That'll add our data labels there. I want to make my plot area a little smaller so the data label doesn't overlap the bar. And now I also want to make these bars wider. So to do that, I'm going to again right click on a bar, right click, go to Format Data Series. That'll bring up the Format Data Series window, and we're in the series options, we're looking for a gap width. And if I just make that smaller, that'll make the gap between the bars smaller and make the bars bigger. So now we can see that we have some bigger looking bars, and this is starting to look pretty nice. Of course, we want to add a title here. So we're going to go sales by rep for December 2014, something like that. So now with just a few clicks, we have this great looking chart that allows us to visually see our report here, our sales by rep for the month of December. So hopefully you've kind of seen the power of the pivot table here, and it's not really that scary of an item. It's actually very easy to use and extremely powerful, and allows you to quickly summarize and visualize your information. All right, so I want to quickly show you how you can use PivotPal to create this same pivot table report, and how it makes it a little faster to do so. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clear out this report so we can start fresh. And to delete fields out of your pivot table, you can go over here to the pivot table fields list and just left click and drag them out of the area until you see that X next to the mouse icon, and then let go, and that'll delete the field out of the area right there. So now we have this blank pivot table, and I'm just going to go up to the Excel Campus tab on the ribbon and click the PivotPal button. Once you install PivotPal, you'll see this Excel Campus tab up here. And basically, PivotPal is an add-in that I've developed that makes it faster and easier to work with some aspects of pivot tables. So you'll notice one thing when we were building the pivot table, we basically were scrolling through this list over here to try and find our field that we wanted to add to one of these areas. And PivotPal has a built-in search that makes this much faster. So if I want to find salesperson, I can just start typing salesperson. You'll see as I start typing, the results are narrowed down. I can choose salesperson here, hit enter. That'll select it down here in the field list for me. And then I can use these buttons or keyboard shortcuts to place the selected field in the area of the pivot table. So I want to put salesperson in rows, and now it's just added to rows. I also want to put revenue into my values area. This time I use keyboard shortcut Alt-V, and that'll put the revenue in my values area very quickly. The other nice feature of PivotPal is that it automatically formats the values area for you. So you noticed when we added this revenue field, I'll just go ahead and delete the values area out. When we add the revenue field into the values area using the field list, the numbers are not formatted. You can see that they're not formatted. We have to take a few extra steps to format them. However, when we do this with PivotPal, again, I'll add the revenue to the values area. Do this with PivotPal, the numbers automatically formatted, and that's because PivotPal detects the source formatting. So there's a formatting drop down here in PivotPal, and it detects the source formatting of the field. So if I go to the data set, and this button allows you to jump back to the data, you can see our revenue field has this currency format already applied to it. And PivotPal will automatically format that field for you like that. And if your source data is not formatted, or you want to change the format, you can do that very quickly with PivotPal as well. You can just select from any of these predefined options here and format the values area very quickly. And of course, you can change this list here and add your custom formats to it as you like. So in the next video, we're going to learn a few more great features of pivot tables. We're going to take a look at some of the different calculation types, and also how to add more data to your data set and apply filters and a whole lot more. So as you can see, Andy's pretty excited about pivot tables, and I hope you are too. But I'd love to know what you think, so please leave a comment below with any questions or suggestions. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Welcome to Excel Campus. My name is John, and this is the second video in a series on pivot tables and dashboards. In the first video, we met Andy and learned about a project his boss has given him. He needs to take this sheet of data and turn it into a nice looking dashboard. We learned how to create our first pivot table and pivot chart. In this video, we're going to create a few more pivot tables and learn how they can help us answer questions about our data. I will explain how we can use the different calculation types to investigate the source data and how to update your pivot tables with more data. And finally, I will demonstrate how PivotPal helps make some of these processes faster and easier. Alright, so this is the pivot table and pivot chart that we created in the first video, and I now want to build out some additional pivot tables and charts that we will ultimately add to our dashboard. So instead of inserting a brand new pivot table, I'm just going to make a duplicate copy of this sheet and then modify the new sheet. So to make a duplicate copy of the sheet, the easiest way to do that is you just left click and hold down on the sheet like you're going to drag it over to the right, then hold down the control key on the keyboard and let go of the left mouse button. That'll make a duplicate copy of the sheet. So now we can just modify this pivot table, our other pivot table is still intact. And the other nice advantage of this is we don't have to format the chart again. The chart's already formatted for us and it will update as we make changes to the pivot table. So now I want to see a report that shows my sales by product category. So I'm going to go ahead and remove salesperson out of the rows area here. And you'll see that's updated the pivot table. So now the only thing in the pivot table is the sum of revenue, and that shows up here and in our chart as well. And now I want to add the product category into my pivot table. So I'm going to find category here in the list, drag it into the rows area. And now that's added all of our product categories here, the rows area. And I also want to sort this. So I'm going to right click here, go to sort, largest to smallest. So now we can quickly see that this company is selling a lot of beverages. That's their top performing category, then dried fruits and nuts and sauces. So those are really their top 3 performing categories. And I actually want to limit this list to just the top 10 categories. So we can quickly do that with a pivot table. I'm just going to click on the filter button here in the rows area. And then I'm going to go to value filters and choose top 10. And that'll bring up this window, and it's basically going to ask us what we want to show. In this case, we want to show the top 10 items by sum of revenue. So it's already set up for us. I'm just going to click OK. And now that'll just filter this list for the top 10 items. And of course, you'd want to rename the title of this chart and this sheet as well. So now I'm going to again make a duplicate copy of the sheet so we can start building out more pivot tables. So again, left click, drag over, hold the control key and release. That'll make a duplicate copy. And I want to show you some different calculation types that the pivot table can do, because so far we've only been dealing with the sum of revenue. First thing I'm going to do though is clear out this filter, because remember we applied this top 10 filter. So I'm just going to click the clear filter button, and that's going to again show us all the categories here. So now I want to start answering some more questions about my category sales. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the unit price here in the values area, and that's going to give me a sum of unit price, which actually isn't all that interesting of a calculation because there's different products within these categories. So I actually want to see the average unit price. So I'm going to right click here, go to value field settings, and now from this window there's some different metric options, and I want to calculate the average instead of the sum. So I'm just going to click average and click OK. And now that's showing us the average unit price now. And we can see that for beverages, our average unit price is around $23. Jams and preserves is a little higher at 43. So what that means is our volume for beverages is probably higher. And to see that, we can just take the quantity field and put it in the values area. And now we have a sum of quantity. And of course, we can see here that we sold a lot of beverages, 763. And that's just about the highest out of all the product categories. The other thing that might be interesting to know is how many orders we sold for each of these categories. So again, I'm going to take the quantity field and drag it into the values area. And instead of sum, I actually want the count. So I'm going to go to value field settings, and now I'm going to choose count from this list, hit OK. And so now that's showing me the count of orders, or the count of rows in my data set for each of these product categories. And the other thing that kind of sticks out here is this blank row. So we have a row of product categories that are blank, and you can see there's eight rows basically of blank product categories. So let's see what's going on with these, because the boss is definitely going to ask about that when he sees this report. So I'm going to filter the category field here for blanks. Just going to go down to the bottom, filter for blanks. And that's basically showing us that here's these 8 blank rows that we're seeing in the pivot table. And we can see there's no product name here. There are some shipping fees. So this might be some kind of shipping fee. And we'd obviously want to ask our billing department about that. But for now, I'll just put shipping fee in the category so we at least know what it is. So with those selected, I'm going to use the Alt semicolon shortcut to select visible cells. Then I'm going to type shipping fee in here. And now I'm going to hold down the Control key on the keyboard and hit Enter. And that'll fill that value or formula in all the selected cells. Control Enter does that. So now if we go back to the pivot table, we'll see it still says blank here because the pivot table needs to be refreshed. And you can do that with any cell selected in the pivot table. You can go to the Analyze or Options tab, and there's a refresh button right here. You can also right-click the pivot table and click Refresh, and then the keyboard shortcut is Alt F5. So I just refreshed there, and now we can see we have our shipping fee down here, and we have a total of 8 of those. So that makes a little more sense since there's no revenue and no quantity coming in for shipping fees. Okay, so I want to show you one of my other favorite calculations. I'm just going to make a copy of the page here. I'm going to remove a few of these fields here, and I'm just going to keep sum of revenue. A lot of times you ask the question, okay, we have revenue for beverages of $17,452. What is that as a percentage of our total revenue? And you can quickly answer that with a pivot table. So I'm going to add our revenue field into the values area again, and that's just created sum of revenue. This time I'm going to right click, go to value field settings, and show values as, this tab here. And now we're going to choose calculation as a percentage of grand total. Click OK. And you can see now that's automatically created that calculation percentage of grand total. So we can now see that beverages makes up almost 25% of our revenue. And we can see these top 3 selling categories make up a big chunk of our revenue, over 50%. So over half of our revenue, 56%, is coming from these top 3 categories here. So then you might ask the question, okay, who's selling in these categories? And we can quickly answer that as well. So if I find my salesperson field here, I'm just going to drag it into the rows area. And now that's automatically added our salesperson. It basically lists all the salespeople that has sold in this specific category. So for each category, it's telling you who has sold in that specific category. And this again provides some interesting metrics because now we can see that Nancy is responsible for selling almost over 10% or 11% of our sales in beverages for the company. So that's a pretty big number. Another interesting way to look at this is if I'm going to take the sum of revenue out of the pivot table, and now I'm going to put salesperson over in columns here. And basically what that's done is it's now listed each of our salespeople across the top here of the pivot table. That's all of our salespeople. And then down the left side, we have our categories. So now you can kind of see which salespeople are selling in each category. So you can just kind of look down the list and see everything that Andrew's doing, which product categories he's selling in, which ones Ann are selling in, and so on. So as you can see with the pivot table, you can really just slice and dice all day long and do different pivots of your data to find trends and analyze it further. Okay, so I'm now going to show you how we can add more data to our data set. So far in this data set, we just have order details for December. But when January rolls around, we're going to want to add that data into this model and then update our pivot table so we can see the data for January as well. So I've been sent the order details for January here. And basically, I'm just going to copy it into my data set. So I'm just going to select the first cell here. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-End on the keyboard. That'll select all my cells there. I'm going to hit Control-C to copy those. And now I'm going to go over to my December file. I'm going to hold down the Control key and press the down arrow on the keyboard. That'll take me to the end of this range here. And I'm just going to hit Control-V to paste my data right in there. So now I have January data pasted right below my December data. If I go over to my pivot table, the pivot table has not actually been updated yet to include that new data. So we have to update the range of the source data that we first specified when we built the table. So you select any cell in the pivot table here, go to the Analyze or the Options tab on the ribbon, and we're going to choose this Change Data Source button. And that's going to bring up this window, and you can see right now our data range is only going to row 68. But if I scroll down to the bottom here, we now need to extend it all the way to row 83. So you can type row 83 in here. Another little trick you can do is if you just select any cell inside the table here and hit Control A on the keyboard, that's going to basically select all. Control A will select all, and it'll select everything in our data range. And so now we've selected everything down to row 83 and click OK. And now you could see that once we did that, the pivot table has been refreshed and updated with the new data, and we have a new total sales of 89,000. Alright, so I now want to show you some features of PivotPal that make it faster and easier to work with your source data when you're building out your pivot tables. So if you remember, we were just investigating this blank down here and these 8 rows that made up that blank. And to do that, we went over to the Data tab, and then we found the category field here and filtered for blanks. And basically that's what we had to do to find those blank rows. Well, PivotPal has a feature that makes this a lot faster and easier. So I'm going to open the PivotPal window here. And basically, the PivotPal has this filter source button that will do all this for us with the click of a button. So I'm just going to select a cell in the values area. In this case, I'm going to select that 8. And then I'm going to click the filter source button. And that'll automatically filter our data source for the category of blank. And you can see it's done that here and filtered for blanks and then showing us those 8 rows. So this will save you a lot of time when you're investigating your data, especially if you have a pivot table like this that's a little more complex with more fields in it. So let's say that we wanted to investigate this number here, this 5,114, which is a sales for Maria for beverages for the West region. So if I just click the filter source button now, that's filtered my source data for the category of beverages for salesperson Maria for the region of West. And it's also automatically selected the revenue column there, so we can tie out our number. Here's 5,114. And again, it's just basically applying those filters to the data set here. So we could see here's our filter for beverages. If we want to jump over to salesperson, select salesperson in the field list, hit the go to data button, and that'll take us over to the salesperson field. And again, it's showing us that it's applied that filter there. Another nice feature of PivotPal is it allows you to build out your pivot table from your source data sheet. So I'm going to hit Alt-AC on the keyboard to clear the filters. And now a lot of times what you'll end up doing is you'll end up flipping back and forth between your pivot table and your source data sheet because you're trying to add a field, but you're not necessarily sure of the name of the field. You know the data that's inside that field, but you're not necessarily sure of how it's named. So you end up flipping back and forth between these. Well, with PivotPal, you can just go to the source data sheet and select any cells. And I select these cells, they're automatically selected in the PivotPal window for you. So you can see I'm just selecting different cells here in the data set, and those fields are then selected for you in PivotPal, and then all you have to do is click one of these buttons to add it to the pivot table. So maybe I want to put this ship name on rows. I can do that by just simply clicking the field and then clicking a button. Maybe I'm going to put my region in my columns area. So I'm going to click region in the data source, click the columns button, and now I can go back to my pivot and see what that looks like. So now we've started building out our pivot table, but we're doing it from the source data sheet. And this just will save you a lot of time because otherwise you spend time just flipping back and forth. And the built-in field list is not available on the source data sheet. So this field list that you typically use to build out your pivot table, that's not available on the source data sheet like it is with the PivotPal window. So in the next video, we're finally going to put our dashboard together. We're going to learn how to group dates into months and years to create a trend chart like this. We're also going to add slicers to our dashboard to make it interactive. And finally, I'm going to show you one of my favorite charts, which is this distribution chart here. So I hope you're as excited as Andy is, and please leave a comment below with any questions or suggestions. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Welcome to Excel Campus. My name is John, and this is the third video on a series about pivot tables and dashboards. In this video, we're finally going to put our dashboard together. In the last two videos, we learned how to create our first pivot table and pivot chart, and then how to use the pivot tables to analyze our data and learn more about our business. In this video, we're finally going to bring it all together and create this nice looking dashboard. And as you can see, Andy is very excited about it. Alright, so this is the workbook we used in the last two videos to create our pivot tables and charts. And in the previous videos, this this table only contained data for December, and now we have all the data for 2014. So as I scroll down here, you'll see there's a lot more data, and we basically have orders for every month out of the year. I've already created a few pivot tables and charts in this workbook, and then we're going to add some more pivot tables and charts and ultimately create our dashboard. You'll also notice in these pivot tables that I've added a field up here in the filters area. So you can see that up here. I've added region in the filters area. You can also see that over here in the field list. There's region in the filters area. And the filters area allows you to filter the entire pivot table for whatever item you select in this filter here. So if we wanted to see all the sales for the East region now, this pivot table is now filtered for the East region. So this is only showing us sales for the East region, and these two particular salespeople are in the East region. So it shows us all that and filters the entire pivot table for whatever you have filtered up here in the filters area. And this is basically how slicers work as well. So I'll explain more about that when we add slicers to our dashboard. So I now want to create that sales trend chart. So I'm going to go to my sales by region chart here, or tab, and make a duplicate copy. Just hold down the control key when you drag it over. And instead of region here in the rows area, I want to add order date. So I'm going to take order date and drop it in the rows area. And you'll see that's added basically a row for every date we have in our order date column in our data tab, and then summed up the revenue for each date. But we actually want to see this by month and year, because having all the dates in here is way too cluttered for our chart, and it doesn't really make much sense. So we can group this order date by month and year. So to do that, I'm just going to select a cell inside the row area here. Go to the Analyze or Options tab on the ribbon and click the Group Field button. That'll bring up this window, this grouping window, and it basically allows us to group by different date types. So we want to group by months, and we also want to group by years. So I'm going to click the years and click OK. So now you can see we have a chart that's much easier to read because we've grouped our dates by months and years. So now this is showing us the total revenue for the month of January and the year 2014. That grouping has also added a field to our rows area. It automatically adds in a new field called years here, and then the order date represents the months. Now this field is not added to our data source. It's just only added to the pivot table here. The other thing with grouping dates, the one thing you want to know is that if your date, so I'm going to go back to the data table here, and this is the field we just grouped within the pivot table, the order date field. If this field contains any blanks in the source data, or if it contains any numbers that are formatted as text or not a date, the grouping will not work. That button over on the pivot table in the Analyze tab, this button here will be grayed out and it won't work. So that's one thing to note. All of your dates in your date field have to have a date that's formatted as a date in the field. Okay, so now we'd obviously want to retitle this chart, and if we wanted to make it a line chart instead of a column chart, we could just select the chart, go to the Design tab on the ribbon, and choose this Change Chart Type button. But I won't go through all that right now. The other chart I want to show you how to create is a distribution chart. So I'm going to go back to my sales by region. Again, I'm going to make a duplicate copy of this sheet. And the first thing I'm going to do is clear out some of the fields here. So I'm going to clear out the rows and values area. We don't need filters as well. So we'll just kind of start blank here. And I'm going to find the revenue field in the list here, and I'm going to drag it into the rows area. So now that's going to basically list all of our revenue amounts for each order. This would be the total revenue amount for each order in our data set here, which doesn't tell us a whole lot. So what I want to do is group this field. So I'm just going to click on any cell here and go to the Analyze tab or the Options tab and hit Group Field. You can also do this from the right-click menu, by the way. You can just right click and select group, and that'll bring up this window. And now we want to group by amount. So this is showing us our minimum amount and our maximum amount, and then we want to group by 1,000. So we'll just leave it at those default settings and click OK. And basically now it's grouped our revenue by amount, so it's put it in different buckets here by increments of 1,000. So the next thing I want to do is take the revenue field again and drag it into the values area. And that's created a count of revenue for each of these buckets. So basically what this is telling us is that we had 218 orders with an invoice amount or revenue amount of $0 to $1,000. 85 orders with an amount of $1,000 to $2,000. And we can see that over here in the chart as well. So this is extremely useful information. And I love these distribution charts because it quickly shows us, by just glancing at this chart, we can see that this company has the majority of their orders are under $2,000. Their invoice amounts are under $2,000. And then they have some larger invoices out here, but only a few of those. So if this company was looking to grow their total revenue, one way to do that would be to increase your invoice amount. So if they had more invoice amounts in the $2,000 to $4,000 range, then obviously their total revenue would go up. The other way to do that would be to increase their volume. If you got too many buckets out here and there's just a lot of data on the chart, you can limit this. So again, click any cell in the row area, go to Analyze, Group Field, and you could change the ending amount. If I change this to 4,000, that'll limit the number of groups down to, the maximum will be 4,000. And now anything with the invoice amount over 4,000 will just end up in this bucket here. The other way you could do that is to change the increment amount to a larger amount to like 2,000, and then that would decrease the number of groups. Okay, so I now want to create the dashboard tab. So I'm just going to insert a new sheet. You can click the new sheet button or Shift F11 on the keyboard, and we'll rename this dashboard. And I'm just going to select all the cells on the sheet here and fill them with a gray color so our charts stand out on the dashboard a little bit. And now I'm going to go to each sheet and basically copy in the dashboard. So you can select the chart, right click and copy, or you can use Control C and Control V and then go over to the dashboard and paste it in here. Alright, so I just copied in all of my charts into the dashboard sheet here. And I'm going to show you a few little formatting tricks, and then we'll add the slicers. First thing I'm going to do is hold down the Control key and just scroll down with the mouse to zoom out a little bit so we can see them all. And you'll notice that all these charts are different sizes, so I want to make them all the same size. I like the size of this chart here, so if I go up to the Format tab on the ribbon, and I can see the size here is 2 by 3.5. Let's make that 3.5. So we have 2 by 3.5. So I want to make all the other charts the same size. So I'm just going to select this one, hold down the Control key. That'll allow me to select multiples. Then I'll go to the Format tab, and I'll make this 2 by 3.5, like that. So now all of my charts are the same size. There's also some alignment options. So if I just click or left click and Control left click to select both of those, Format tab, Align, and then now I can choose from all these alignment options here. So I could align left, and that'll line those both up to the left. So you can spend a little time kind of getting them all aligned nicely and make it look nice. The other issue you might come across is if you put any text here and let's say you make one of these columns wider, that changes the size of the chart there. To prevent that, I'm going to, again, left click this chart, then hold down the Control key to select all of my charts. And now if I go up to the Format tab, there's this little button here to the bottom right of the size group. I'm going to click that. That'll bring up my Format Shape dialog, and in the Property section, if you're looking for the Property section, select this option that says Don't Move or Size with Cells. And so basically that allows the chart to remain the same size, and when you resize the cells, the chart's sizes do not change. Alright, so let's add our slicers. So I'm going to select this first sales trend chart here. And I'm going to go to the Insert tab on the ribbon and choose Slicer. And that's going to bring up a list of all the fields basically in our pivot table. And we want to slice by salesperson and region. So I'm going to select those two fields and click OK. and that'll add the slicers into our sheet here. And so basically those are connected to this sales trend chart, and if we click any of the options here, that'll slice the sales trend chart. You'll also notice when you if you select on the border of the slicer, you'll get this options tab up here on the ribbon, and this will allow you to change the properties of the slicer, like the different colors. The other one you'll use often is the columns. If you change the columns here, that'll allow you to change basically the layout of the slicer if you want. We're going to leave this at one column. So this slicer is currently only slicing or filtering this chart up here. We need to connect it to our other charts and pivot tables. So I'm going to right click on the slicer and go to Report Connections. It's going to bring up a list of all of our pivot tables in the workbook, and I'm just going to select all of these so the slicer is connected to all of our pivot tables and charts, and click OK. And now you'll see when we make a selection that all of the charts on the page are being filtered, and you could select multiple by just holding down the mouse and then drag down select multiple. So we also need to connect the region to all of our charts. So I'm going to do the same thing, go to Report Connections, just select all of these pivot tables and click OK, and now the region will be connected to all of our charts as well, so we can slice for the different regions. And even though these slicers are on our dashboard sheet, they also actually filter all the other pivot tables in the workbook. So if I go over to my sales by rep sheet, you'll see that it's being filtered for the North region for the sales rep Michael. And again, if I go back to the dashboard, that's exactly what my slicers are applying, is this filter for Michael and the North region. So that's why I like to have any field that I have in a slicer, I like to have in one of my areas of the pivot table, especially the filters, because now you can see by just looking at this specific pivot table on this sheet that it's being filtered by the North region. If this was not in our filters area, you wouldn't be able to see that by just looking at the pivot table, and it might get a little confusing. So we've basically been able to put together a dashboard here with pivot tables and pivot charts, and then just adding these slicers to make it interactive. Of course, you'll want to add a title up here and maybe your company logo as well, and then line up all the charts and make sure all the titles are correct and everything, and also line up the slicers. But all in all, we were able to take this sheet of data, this giant sheet of data, and turn it into a nice looking interactive dashboard with just a few pivot tables and pivot charts. Alright, so I now want to show a few new features of PivotPal based on some of your requests and feedback. The first one is a layouts tool. So typically when you create a pivot table, it's in this layout here with the subtotals up at the top and in a compact form. And you can see that by going to the Design tab on the ribbon, and you can choose some of these different settings for subtotals, grand totals, report layout. You can also go to the Analyze tab and into the Options menu, and there's a ton of options here that you can choose and select to make your pivot table look and behave a certain way. But these options are time consuming to actually apply, and they take a lot of steps to do that. So PivotPal has this new feature called Pivot Layouts, and this window here will basically allow you to save some of your custom layouts and then quickly apply them to your pivot table. So here I've already saved a few layouts that I like. For example, this one shows more of a report style with the totals at the bottom down here. It also adds blank rows between each pivot item and a lot of other settings that it automatically applies. This one, for example, outline with repeating labels, is one that I created that will just show the pivot table in outline form and repeat all the labels. So this might be good for some kind of lookup if you're trying to look up data in the pivot table with all these repeating labels over here. So with the My Pivot layouts, you can basically do anything you want. Any of these different options for the pivot table you can change and customize, and then you can save the layout, save a new layout, and do all these things with these layouts, so you can create your own custom ones and apply them very quickly. The other exciting news is that PivotPal now works with Power Pivot pivot tables. So if your data models contain hundreds of fields, PivotPal will make it very easy to search through those fields, find the field you're looking for in different tables. You can see I have different tables listed here in my search results, and then add that field to your pivot table. So for example, if I wanted to add the month field across the top in my columns here, I could just search month. I'll find it in my dates table here, and then just add it to the columns area, and that'll add it to this Power Pivot pivot table here. So I hope these videos have helped you learn how powerful and easy pivot tables are to use. As you can see, Andy's boss is very excited about his results, and I'm sure your boss will be as well. I want to thank you for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe to my free email newsletter to get more tutorials like this and information about PivotPal. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.